he started reading the book of Acts, which is Luke's second volume. It's written after the book of Luke. And he says, wait a minute, this thing ends with Paul in house arrest in Rome and doesn't proceed any further. It doesn't make any sense, given what we know of that period, that, what happened in Rome, it, caught on fire and the Christians were tortured as a result of Nero's persecution, and Jerusalem was destroyed. None of that is mentioned. In fact, the weird thing is the entire last 8 chapters of Acts is building up to Paul's trial. Paul's trial isn't even mentioned in the book of Acts. So there are a number of these early liberals, these early 19th century liberals who began to question the dating of the book of Acts. And I think that's been a lost branch that some people are now recovering. Another guy named John A.T. Robinson famously wrote a book called Redating the New Testament. Very liberal guy, liberal theology, but he started coming to very conservative dating conclusions. And he said the entire New Testament was written before 70 AD because there aren't any references to the destruction of the temple before as a completed event. There are some hints that these things are gonna happen. Jesus will talk about the destruction of the temple as a prophecy, but you would think, especially Luke, because Luke mentions that prophecy, but he never says, and these things were fulfilled in the days of Titus. In the book of Acts, he does talk about the famine that was going to take place as a prophecy, the prophecy of Agabus. And he says these things were fulfilled in the days of Claudius. So he comes in and steps in as the narrator to help show these things were fulfilled. Well, the book of Acts concludes without a mention of Paul's trial, without a mention of the destruction of the temple. And so I think that's it should at least give us pause about the dating. Now, if that's the case, one of the things that keeps liberals from not moving there is that in the beginning, he says many gospels have already been written. And most scholars argue that Luke used Matthew and Mark. So if Luke is dated before the destruction of the temple, so too would Matthew and Mark. You'd have to date them earlier than Luke. And there are also there's present tense language in the book of Acts where Luke says the gate in the temple is called the Beautiful Gate. The Solomon's portico, this place is called the Portico of Solomon. So compare that to Josephus. He talks about stuff like this was called because it's no longer there. Another thing is that Paul refers to a passage in Luke's gospel, and he calls it scripture. So he's quoting Deuteronomy, and he says, as the scripture says, if an ox, don't let the ox don't muzzle the ox while it's treading the grain. And then he cites a passage from Luke's gospel about workers being worthy of their wages. His specific citation is similar to something in Matthew, but it's the specific wording from Luke. Well, he just prefaced that by calling it scripture. Scripture is a written reference. Okay, so if this particular quotation is usually dated, 1 Timothy usually dated early 60s. Some people have it late 50s. So that is a suggestion that perhaps Luke has already been written by the time Paul is writing some of his epistles. So there are lots of different arguments like that, and there's present tense language in John as well. We can get into that if you like, but I just think the really good evidence when you look at the internal data from the New Testament itself, it really points to this was written before the destruction of Jerusalem, before the Jewish War, 66 AD.
Yeah, I've heard you say it would be awkward and weird to write about like New York and say use present language for the Twin Towers.
Yeah, there is in New York strange. A place called the World Trade Center with 2 twin towers. If you heard someone say that, you would say you said it wrong. You said there is. You should have said there was. But if you found it in a written text, like a letter stuffed in a library book, and you didn't have a date on the text, that present tense language would you would probably assume, wait, that was probably written before 9/11, before 2001. And that's what we find in texts like John 5:2. There is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate of the temple a place called Bethesda, having 5 porticos. There's a couple present tense verbs in that, and it's written as if Jerusalem's still there and the place of 5 porticos are there. The temple gate, the sheep gate, is still there. There's a place in Matthew's gospel where he says this place, this field that was purchased was called Akeldama, and it's still called that to this day. Well, Josephus says that the Jerusalem was so destroyed that it looked like it was never inhabited, except for a few things that they left, the big things related to palaces, a few walls here and there. So if the entire city looks like it was never inhabited, you wouldn't be able to distinguish one field from the surrounding area. And if people are still calling it, then it's still populated. So the fact that Matthew says this place to this day is called Akeldama, this field in Jerusalem, suggests to me that it's before 70 AD. There's just a lot of arguments like that. You start looking for it, you see it all over the place.
What gives you confidence that the Gospels were eyewitness accounts?
Well, if you start looking at those details, you find that they get everything right. So one of my favorite guys on this is Richard Bauckham. You and I have talked about his work. He is a scholar. He wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And one of the things that he does is he talks about the importance of names. That's one of these details. Names are incredible because they help us to see, number one, these are Palestinian Jewish names. And when you take all the names from the Gospels and Acts and you put them into one single database, they are exactly the kind of names that you find in the actual database that people have collected from what we know of the first century in Palestine. We know these from inscriptions, texts, ossuaries, you name it. We have a database of these names, and not only are they the same kinds of names, but they're the same names in the right ratio. Like what's the most popular name? It's Simon. It's the most popular name in this external database and in the New Testament. Well, there was a guy named Jens Schroeder who criticized Bauckham, saying, well, people just, they wrote these texts giving it credibility, like this is the kind of story I'm going to write, giving it that feel that it's an ancient text. Okay, well, those people wouldn't know, if you're writing the document, they wouldn't know how to sort of give the right ratio of the names, especially when you're combining Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts together. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. There's no way this could work if you're trying to fake it. It's a very good evidence that these are real names and not fictional names. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. You look at the botanical information, the geographical information, you look at the customs, everything we can see when we check it with what we know about first century Jewish life and culture, it gets exactly right again and again and again.